Okay, so we're ready. You could take it off.
We are ready if you want to start.
Okay. Okay, perfect. I think right now the only thing is that the screen that is being pinned is, I think someone is sharing their screen, so maybe we can remove that so that we can see the panelists instead.
Okay, so I
Okay.
removed it.
Yeah, okay, great. Great. Well, hi everyone. I can't see people in the room, but thank you on behalf of the organizers of the third Ethical Considerations in Creative Applications of Computer Vision workshop. We're really excited about this third iteration of the workshop, and we're hoping to build on the success of the past workshops. We have a really exciting program lined up with in a few minutes, we'll have a multidisciplinary panel on cultural inclusion in generative AI. Then we'll have some incredible paper spotlight sessions, a very exciting generative art demo and panel with artists and filmmakers and curators. And then we'll close off with poster sessions and the best paper announcement. So I also just wanted to give a chance for all the co-organizers who are here to kind of introduce themselves. So I'm Rida. I'm a research scientist at Google Research, Responsible AI and Human-Centered Technology org. And then I think we can do the virtual organizers first, and then maybe go to the organizers who were there in person. So Emily, do you want to introduce yourself?
You're muted.
Oh, Emily, we can't hear you for some reason. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
How's that?
Okay, perfect.
Better? Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm also a research scientist within Google, same as Rita. I'm calling in from New York today, so I'm sorry to not be there in Vancouver with all of you, but I am really looking forward to all the panels, the poster sessions, and all of the really generative conversations that I think are gonna come throughout the day. So happy to be here with you all.
Nigar and Shalale, I think, are the other two organizers who are here in virtually.
Hello, I'm Nekar, and I'm also from Google. I'm a researcher at Google, Responsible AI team, and I'm calling from Montreal, and I couldn't be there in person. Happy to have you all here. Shalala.
Hello, I'm Sally. I'm a PhD student at McGill in Montreal. And welcome everybody.
And then maybe the in-person organizers can give a little wave.
Hi, I'm Zia. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Utah. Thank you for coming to the workshop.
I'm Sarah. I'm a research scientist at Google Research, Responsible AI. Thank you for coming.
Hi, I'm Mohammed. I'm a research scientist at Google. Thank you for coming.
Great. Great. Well, I see our four panelists are here, so maybe we can just get started. So the first panel that we'll start this workshop off with is really important in terms of framing the conversation that we'll have in the rest of the workshop. In particular, this year, we're focusing on most of our programming on the question of culture and generative AI. And why are we having this focus? Because we think this sort of field of inquiry is increasingly important as generative image and vision models are on one hand globalizing rapidly and are also being productionized for a very diverse global user base. And then at the same time, these models are also increasingly producing and staging cultural artifacts like literature, film, art, music. And so that kind of requires us to not just view these models from a singular lens of one particular discipline, but also consider questions of cultural quality and representation and inclusion. And so that's why the first panel I'm hearing an echo, so I don't know if that's from the CVPR workshop folks, or I don't know if anyone else can hear an echo, and if not, that's fine. So that's why the first panel focuses on questions of cultural inclusion, representation, and cultural impact with regards to generative image technologies. And so we have an incredible multidisciplinary roster of critical media scholars, computational artists, ML experts, cultural theorists, discussing whether current generative models can or should become more inclusive of global populations, and how, as researchers and practitioners, we should think about the cultural impact of this current moment. So I can introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. And so as I introduce you, if you could just like unmute yourself and give a little wave so people at the conference, at the workshop can see you. So we'll start off with Dr. Maya Indra Ganesh. Dr. Maya is a media and digital cultures theorist, researcher, and writer, as well as a current course leader of the Masters of AI Ethics and Society program at Cambridge University's Leverhulme Center for Future of Intelligence. Maya earned her DPhil in Cultural Sciences from Leuphana University in Germany, where her work examined the reshaping of what we mean by ethical and the shifting role of the human in the emergence of the driverless car. And prior to Maya's academic work, Maya spent many years working at the intersection of gender, justice, digital security, and data privacy in a variety of global regions. So welcome, Maya. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. Thanks, Rida.
Okay, we are also joined by Harshit Agarwal, who is a computational and AI artist, as well as a human-computer interaction researcher. Harshit graduated from the Fluid Interfaces group at MIT Media Lab, and also he was also at the Indian Institute of Technology. He's carried out art residences at various places around the world to develop his practice within diverse cultural contexts, and he uses his work to invite people to reflect upon and reevaluate their ever-evolving relationship with technology.
Hey, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Great. Okay, we're also joined by Yassine Jernait. Yassine is currently leading the ML and Society team at Hugging Face, where he works on ML systems governance at the intersection of regulatory and technical tools. His work focuses on questions of data curation, documentation, governance, and he recently was a co-author on a really powerful paper on social representations in text-to-image models, which I'm excited to dig into in this panel.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. Happy to be here.
Great. And finally, Professor Katrina Sluis, who is head of photography and media arts in the School of Art and Design at the Computational Culture Lab in Australian National University. Katrina's research is broadly concerned with the politics and aesthetics of art and photography in computational culture. Katrina has worked as a curator and educator around the questions of with museums and galleries to support digital strategy, digital programming, and pedagogy, and works at this like extremely exciting intersection of machine curation, photography, and digital cultures. Katrina, could you just mute and give a wave?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction. Very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Okay. So if there are no kind of like technical issues, if everyone can hear us, we can excited to get started and dig in, because we have lots of fun things to chat about. So I want to start off with a question for for all of you to kind of mull over a little bit, maybe just to get the conversation started. So we'll for the audience, we'll chat for the next like 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for audience Q&A. So for our panelists today, we've talked a lot about cultural inclusion, cultural representation in the introduction of this panel, and these conversations have also really begun to take shape within the wider ML and ethics and responsibility community, where there is a concern and an understanding that we want to make our models and our technologies more inclusive and representative of global populations. So we wanted to get a sense from all of you about how you understand cultural inclusivity and representation in the context of generative AI and generative image models specifically. And if you were to think of sort of a North Star that you would want us to aim towards, what would that look like? So maybe we can start with Katrina.
Great, thanks for that question, Rita. I would just briefly say, because I'll probably have a chance to expand on this a bit later, that as a kind of scholar of visual culture, I see sort of generative AI as a new phase in a much longer history of technical images and the politics of representation, which incorporates the apparatus of the camera and the image archive. And so we're seeing this radical shift in the ontology of images, which we have yet to fully understand. However, I'm very much interested in the kind of politics of representation that are being encoded in these systems, which are very hard to for scholars to understand, because they can only critique and understand the output of such models. And conversely, computer scientists see, the cultural data or the photographs that many of these image models train upon as neutral carriers of data. And so a much longer history of the camera as a colonizing tool, as a kind of political apparatus for expressing power relations between who has the power to represent and who is represented, is very much bound up in these new tools. So in terms of a North Star, I think I would be really interested in moving from a discussion of bias to power, and to move from a position of more diversity in both training sets, staff, outputs of models, as we often hear, to how generative AI is reconfiguring visuality and ways of seeing and knowing. And I think these are the kind of questions through which we begin to understand how these cultural representations proliferate and come into being.
Great. Yeah, that was really rich and lots to unpack. Yassine, maybe you could go next.
Yeah, so most of my work is situated with the users and getting a sense of what it means for the direct and indirect users to see themselves represented, which usually comes through two lenses. For the people using the models, are they seeing themselves represented when other people are using the tools, or are they going to have either no representation or stereotypical representations of people like them or how they want to be seen? And people who are trying to use the tool themselves to create media or images or text according to their wishes, are they going to be able to do that? Are they going to be able to create images that represent what they want? Or are they going to be always pulled to the US context representation of whatever context they're going to be looking at? With that, there's a lot we can do in terms of tooling. My focus is mostly on governance, so less on things that are measured post-hoc and more at looking at process that encourages that kind of representation. And that usually means thinking of the models as a representation of the training set, and thinking of creating those training sets as we have thought in the past about what it means to create a museum, a library, like what goes into that and who that's going to represent. Kind of the North Star there is getting never one single model, but more models and more tools for different contexts, and to have curation and intentional curation of the content that goes into training those models.
Maya, maybe you could go next.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and very happy to be here and in conversation with all of you, really. So I think my opening sort of thoughts on this maybe align a little bit with what Katrina just said, but two provocations. First, if cultural inclusivity is the answer, then what is the question? And second, that image models are actually language models. And so by the first piece about cultural inclusivity, I think the question of how to make image generational models more representative is, if that is the answer to, if that is the question to which cultural inclusivity is the answer, then I think we must reorganize and understand what image generation is for. If the purpose of image generation is not to be representative, right? It's to perform certain kinds of operations, statistical, computational, that deliver images in response to natural language prompts. And those language prompts are already representations in a world of data and a world known through data. And we don't have images coming into these models with, sort of extensive annotations, but we know kind of the back end of what these systems look like. And there's just kind of like words associated with these images tagged in very large sort of outsourcing industries. So I think when I'm saying that an image model is a language model, I'm saying that I think we need to look at the fact that our language has all these representations really baked into it already, and the two are very sort of combined. And so I think that the worlds that are represented are sort of fully formed. So I don't know what cultural inclusivity is. A much bigger project, I think, than just saying we need more of this or that. And I think others have pointed to that, and you've said that yourself, Rida, in opening this. So my concern is that I don't want cultural inclusivity to be this free-floating empty signifier that it's just more business as usual. Let's not do it for its own sake. And I'm curious to see how we will work through that in the coming years. I would say my North Star, oh, actually, I just thought of that when you said North Star. I was sort of also clocking that Katrina is in Australia in the southern hemisphere, and you can't actually see the North Star in the southern hemisphere, and kind of was this amusing aspect of sort of the cultural hegemony of people in the northern hemisphere and our seasons and things like that. So your North Star or your South Star might be, or mine might be that. I would actually like to see more cultural and visual literacy happen in sites of production of these technologies and the culture that's reshaping the world, as well as with different kinds of publics who are actually skilled in visual culture and visual studies. And I feel like it's not just about more artists playing with these tools, but I think there's a whole rich history of thinking about visual culture that I would love to see more in conversation with the governance. There's a big push for governance now, but I think there's a visual culture part that we need to draw on. There's a rich history there. So I'll stop for now, and happy to come back to this later. Thanks.
Yeah, again, so many threads to pull on. Harshit, maybe you could close us off or kind of like open us up for further conversation.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure this will open up larger, I think, thoughts. So I actually, I think I completely align with most of what everyone said, but I also wanted to bring in two personal anecdotes from my art practice, basically, to just think through these questions a bit more. So one of them is about me working with an artist in South India, and they do a certain kind of face painting, and I was sort of working towards collecting data around that to basically create an interactive artwork, right? And one of the understandings that I got from the artist was that this is a culturally sensitive performance and probably not the best idea for everyone to be able to experience this in an interactive context. But also expanding on that, the notion of the artist also sort of, and I say this with all respect, obviously, to the artist, that the artist was in somewhat agreement to share data about that if there were certain financial models around available for doing that, right? So there's a certain individual aspect of these kind of cultural aspects that we often miss in these kind of conversations, and I wanted to bring that to the table. So I think the idea of financial models being built around the aspect of bringing cultural data onto conversations of AI machine learning, I think that is very important and often not spoken about enough. So taking this example in context to this discussion that we are having, right? Like the artist sort of understands that providing data equals to getting some kind of financial reward for that. So data equals in some ways financial incentives, right? But what are there enough financial models that we have in place to ensure that we allow people to not, trade data for money in some ways? Can we build systems that ensure that, and therefore bake in a certain cultural nuance onto a machine learning models? And I think something that's linked to this is also the idea that there is a certain way in which machine learning works, which is which we all know, but it produces outputs that um, may not fit a context, right? Like if it's some kind of a religious context, for example, there's a certain exactness of visual outcome that is expected. And in a lot of cases currently, that exactness is not possible through AI/ML models. Even we're getting better and better, but there's some things that we're not prepared to produce in the correct sort of degree of exactness that is required. And how do we ensure that there is enough financial de-incentivization to wait till we get to that point before actually producing that, right? And we don't, in the name of sort of inclusion, just let out stuff that isn't actually culturally sensitive at the end of the day. So I think I just wanted to bring up these two anecdotes. The second one is also actually a very personal anecdote because I play with machine learning models a lot, visual generation models a lot. And I sort of talking to my mom about creating some images in the religious context, right? And she was like, but you can't like share these, like these are not like, look at the hands, for example, right? They're not correct. And I'm like, yeah, mom, but like AI doesn't do hands yet. So she's like, then don't show me these images. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? So I think there is, what is happening as just as a closing remark to this thought is the rate at which like the access to AI is happening for people is, I guess, faster than the rate at which their knowledge of what are the boundaries of AI and what are the limitations of AI, right? So they don't know what to actually expect. And I think that balance also needs to be maintained. So basically, I think the North Star would be to financially, in some ways, incentivize actually limiting of what models can do till they're ready to actually do culturally sensitive things, which is not the case right now. So I wanted to, let that thought out and build up on these thoughts as we talk this.
Yeah, I mean, I love all of these answers because on one hand, you've all highlighted different aspects of cultural inclusion. So, whether that's inclusion in terms of training data, whether that's inclusion in terms of tooling, in terms of governance, in terms of visual literacy, but then also kind of hinted at the limits of inclusion as a framing for models, and kind of hinted at broader sort of cultures of development and structural conditions, like cultures of sharing and cultures of the context of where you are sharing and what you are sharing, that also need to form our opinions about cultural inclusion of our systems in general, not just the models. So something I want to kind of maybe start with is maybe start at the kind of data and model level, and then expand out to some of these broader questions of governance and power and cultures of sharing and what we're sharing. And so often one kind of response that we get to the question of inclusion, and some of you also mentioned this, is training data, diversifying training data, diversifying what you have. And interestingly, you sort of said this phrase, which was like, it's not just about having more of something, but there's sort of another kind of fundamental shift that you're thinking of. So I'm wondering how I'd love to kind of like learn more from you about how you were thinking about this question of having more training data on one hand, or diversifying our training data as part of this cultural inclusion program, and what are some of the tensions and limits to that? And then I'd also love everyone else's opinion on this question.
Do you want me to start, Rida?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. I can I have some things I could say, but I was also just wondering if I could show anything, because it sort of struck me that as a panel or a discussion about visual images, it's a bit strange for me not to show some stuff. And I've been trying to do some experiments of my own. So let me see if I can get it to work and have it make sense. But I think the first point of just about data itself, I find it interesting that, you know, those of us who've been following these conversations and working in these areas, it's interesting to see the sort of shifts in the conversations we have as well about how we talk about these things. So we're now saying, yes, we recognize bias as an issue, but with the sort of focus on eliminating bias as a mathematical computational function, we recognize the limits of that. We recognize the limits of just having more of something in the data, and we're trying to push towards something kind of more deeper and structural, I think. So I recognize that we have been saying these things for a long time from different perspectives, and we are kind of all trying in different ways to pull at it. So the sort of ground floor level is that AI could always do with more data. It is a data machine. And so I think that's one kind of very fundamental tension in the sort of situation that we're encountering right now with data. But I don't think we can just make it about, you know, we need more data and this license to collect data. I think at this point with the GDPR and questions of copyright that image generation models are having to deal with, I feel like from a governance perspective, I really do want to know what's happening with the status of the GDPR and all of the various sort of like copyright cases that are going on. So that's one way that I think about data and its flows and regulations, because that is also part of the conversation. The other part of it is when I think about data as a researcher, now in a research field, you collect data to answer a particular question, and you look at it and you say, what does this data say? What can it be used for? And what does it tell us about the world that it was collected from? What are the relationships we can see in it? And certainly you're doing this in the research that kind of, this is fundamental to a kind of Western empirical science. So it's what you do in building the computing and the technologies that we're talking about. So I find that an image model is also sort of working as an analytical tool. It is actually only just putting out this, it is telling us what the behavior is of the data that's already there in quite intransparent data sets. So I think that's also something that we have to recognize, that the image that is being put out has sort of a pre-life and an afterlife. And so I think that it's not just about more of one thing. And I've been kind of a little bit obsessed recently with the pictures of women in image generation models. And this started about 6 or 7 months ago when a journalist asked me to use a Lensa app because she wanted to write about, you know, what happens with the diversity of women being represented in Lensa. And then I just sort of started playing around with these things. And let's see if I can just show you something that makes it, okay. Let's see if I can show you this. Oh, okay. This is probably not going to happen. You know why? Because this is a brand new computer and I haven't set up a whole bunch of sharing permissions. This is slightly upsetting because I had, anyway. Well, I've been trying to look at women and ask the question of these images of women in image models. What are they actually about? And unfortunately, I'm going to have to explain it to you. And explaining images is my least favorite thing to do sometimes when I'm talking about them. But essentially, what I think I'm finding is that the pictures of women, when I search for them, and the prompts are things like a woman in a forest in South India doing an ecologist in a forest in South India, or I'm asking the famous meme woman laughing alone with salad. There's two sisters hanging out watching TV. There's an artist, an Indian artist, Indian origin artist, I think, whose prompt is all over Instagram or was about 6 months ago. Sisters hanging out watching TV, eating cake, and cats. And all of these prompts are basically resulting in these pictures of women that are not just, I don't think they're scary, they're just awfully broken and they're really incomplete. And I'm at the same time, I'm seeing on social media, I'm seeing people posting pictures of like these supermodel type women, you know, because the emphasis is on the lighting. The emphasis is on, you know, this person in the style of this fantasy game or Wes Anderson. And it's very much about the techniques that even allow us to look good, pre-image generation models that, you know, look good in front of a camera generally. But when I'm just asking for who is the person, this woman that is doing something somewhere in the world, of everyday people, they're pretty terrible images. And Hito Steyl recently wrote about them as mean images because she came out looking like really like unflattering images of herself in it. So anyway, I realize I'm probably taking up a little too much time now, and I kind of might ramble as well about the images that I can't show you. So I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully I can come back to this. I'm just seeing this as a sort of like prompt right now, and maybe we can talk about it more. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. This is, this is an ongoing conversation where this panel is just even this entire panel. I think this is the first step, or one of the many first steps. Yasin, I actually wanted to kind of link what Maya was saying to something I was curious about your opinion on. So Maya sort of talked about some of these images that have come up. You've also written some papers on this. We recently wrote a paper on what we call AI's regimes of representations, sort of the cultural representations that emerge of South Asia, in our case. And you've written about social representations. So from your perspective, what are some of these like reasons that the images that Maya talked about, or the images that you've seen, are coming up, and what are the barriers that you're seeing to inclusion and representation in generative models in a global context?
Yeah, there's so much to say in that, and so much to react on what Maya was just talking about. I think one thing I would briefly say is, like, one of the things you mentioned was GDPR and copyright, and those are super, like, more relevant than we sometimes think, because they're great tools for people to assert their rights and their control over the data that's represented, and that we found are really a part of that conversation. So we talk a lot about the representativity of the data that goes into training, but this is kind of like second order effect of the representation of the people developing the technology. So I will go back to a large language model training endeavor I worked on, Big Science, which has kind of the same questions, where we wanted to train a multilingual large language model. And there's two ways to go about that, right? Two ways people have done that in the field. One is that, like, massively multilingual efforts where people come from their own setting and their own cultural setting and are saying, how can I get like all of the languages in the world covered in my efforts? And we really didn't want to do that. And instead we took the approach of saying, we're going to have a model that is not representative of the whole wide world, but that is representative of the people who worked on building it. And we're going to try to get as many people involved in building it in the sake of having more inclusion there. But the goal is never to have something that's universal. And that came through a lot of social efforts, more than technical effort for that huge project, getting people involved, meeting people where they are. The approach was inherently limited because we found people around the world who we had connected to through the shared perspective of being machine learning developers. So that's like that's more geographical representativity, but there's still a lot missing. But we end up in ways that are sometimes very hard to trace with model after that system that are representative in our views in ways that we don't necessarily expect. So for example, I'm very involved in looking at how political concepts are represented. And I found that even though my hand there had been like shaping the processes and not selecting the data points, we ended up with a model that was whose definition of political concept was a lot more aligned with what I believe than a lot of other models. Another thing to look at is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ernie VLG image generation model, which was trained by Chinese teams in China. If you're comparing that to Stable Diffusion on things like, one prompt that really worked is generate City Hall in Beijing. you get the Chinese model, it generates you like a modern building with like glass panels everywhere. You get stable diffusion. I think OpenAI might do the same thing. It gets you a like perspective of like traditional Chinese architecture. A very long way to answer that the main cultural barrier to inclusivity is not so much from your computer in the US or in Europe trying to go look for what's going to be data that's representative of other parts of the world. It's being able to build technology with people with other perspectives in other parts of the world and have them bring in the kind of perspectives and data and approaches and priorities that they need, which might not be having a tool that does the same thing that you want it to do.
Yeah, absolutely love that. Like we're kind of centering on questions of community participation and agency, as opposed to just kind of necessarily like technical model fixes. I'm wondering if any of the other panelists have any kind of reflections on this before we continue the conversation.
Can I jump in? That was really, really interesting. I think one of the questions it raises for me then with this community work is the power imbalance between those who control the technology and those communities who are asked to do the work of building more socially inclusive models. And I'm wondering, you know, how is that being resolved in your research? And, you know, like, you know, people who are marginalized, et cetera, as well, like, you know, taking the time to then improve a model or generate new models is a very interesting and research problem. So I'd love to hear more about that.
I mean, I can reply to how we approached it in that project, and a lot of it is giving up power and giving up priorities. And because obviously, like if you're saying like to say we're going to train this kind of large language models and we want you to be involved because we want like this framing of the question to represent some of your perspectives, that doesn't work. Some of what we try to do is we came with this idea of training a large language model and then be open to people saying, actually, this is a bad idea. This is not what we need. One thing here was we came with this idea of getting people who are native speakers of African languages to come in and participate. And the first reaction we had was actually what would be more useful is for us to start creating those smaller data sources that are not going to be as useful to you. And we managed, in this case, to meet in the middle, where we encourage hackathon and community events that were tailored at creating resources that were more useful for their context and their applications, and that as a byproduct, we're going to provide data that was also valuable to the primary goal. It's something that can happen in these kinds of large open collaborations where you can stretch the goals and you can shape it as it goes. I do not have an answer for when you have a predefined project with a predefined timeline. You know, my answer is like, don't rush these kind of projects.
Yeah, I also wanted to, sort of bring back, I think, something that I touched upon earlier. I think this is a great sort of model of community building models, etc. But I think also at the same time, there's obviously requirements for communities to be able to, or channels for them to be able to stand up and say, we don't want this to be digitally included at all, right? And that are there ways that we are able to ensure that people have that kind of a voice also, where the only way that they can participate is not to, learn how to train a model and collect data images for that and then train the model so that this sort of model increases its inclusivity, but are also able to stand up and very clearly sort of communicate that, we don't see this being generated by a machine, and these are the reasons why, and then there's enough respect to then make sure that models exclude that. And in some ways, I mean, we're seeing companies responding to that from like brands kind of perspective, right? Like I think Adobe Firefly, for example, has restricted its ability to create images of, let's say, Disney characters and stuff like that, which other models allow currently. So there is a certain limitation of what can be created. That is a thought out decision. Can we think of parallels of that where, let's say, financial models are not in place, that is culturally sensitive aspects, and we ensure that we are creating enough channels for them to voice out their, they're not feeling good about having that be part of an AI system.
Yeah, I think all of this is kind of reminding me of something that Katrina sort of opened this panel with, and I'm wondering, Katrina, if you want to talk a little bit more about this question of power and how you were talking about maybe the framing that we want to be shifting towards, especially as like machine learning researchers or in people involved in studying and working with these or producing these technologies. Is this the kind of shift that you were kind of alluding to, this thinking about questions of not bias, but who has power to be represented in the data, or who has power to use the technologies or shape the technologies? And are there sort of some lessons from the history of image technologies that we can learn from here when it comes to power?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been fascinated in the literature how representativeness kind of includes representation. And how if we can just correct the statistical balance of the data set, somehow it will be cured. Whereas if you, for example, study photography and are given a camera, a lot of the discussion is about what is this tool? What is its power to represent? Who has cameras? Who doesn't have cameras? And how has that been historically sort of understood? So if you're holding a camera, you'll be thinking about responsibility. You'll be thinking about framing. You'll be thinking about context and dissemination. Do you caption it? What kind of knowledge comes with the image? And so the power to visualize and control images and who has the right to speak and represent the world is historically a very important kind of question. And now we have large image models which allow anyone to produce, not like I'm talking about photography here, obviously it can produce digital images that simulate paintings, but you can just take make any photograph now without actually having to be present and confront that person and be situated in that environment with all the kind of baggage that evolves. So you're abstracted away from what it is that you're representing. And I just was thinking about this, and I know you and I have spoken about this also, about the kind of colonial archive and the use of the camera in sort of the history of photography, and forms of counter representation that artists and photographers have used to create their own dialogue with the archive, right? So speaking from an Australian perspective, in the 19th century, European photographers came and photographed the noble savage. They placed Aboriginal Australians in photo studios that were painted in this kind of way of this naturalization because they had the cameras, and they were disseminating these images to a hungry British public. And contemporary Aboriginal photographers such as Tracy Moffat now will purposely reappropriate these images and create counter representations of colonial images in which she's presenting, you know, the black male body of the Aboriginal dancer as a contemporary model of subjectivity and culture, and asserting that. So these are kind of very political tools, right? So I'm interested then in thinking about what is the ethical kind of contract, both of the user of this technology and those who are creating the ability to generate these images. And of course, if you type in an Aboriginal Australian into Midjourney, you'll get like someone who isn't urban, isn't a professional, all the kind of stuff that you would imagine. So I think there is another kind of violence that can happen in generative image models as well, where cultural knowledge embedded in sort of non-Western forms of representation are kind of abstracted and reproduced without any of that knowledge coming with them. And the example I'm thinking here of is Aboriginal art and desert painting, which is a form of cultural production where circles, lines, dots, things that can be very easily reproduced with a diffusion model and are completely reproduced as pattern and randomness rather than as situated cultural knowledge. So there are quite interesting questions about how these models, well, the limits of their representation, the reinforcement of statistical norms, and actually what is it that the generative AI system is reproducing? It's reproducing the archive, and what's quite fascinating about it is actually interrogating it and seeing the limits of its own representation, because you're seeing the limits of a kind of scraped visual culture off the internet often, and the archives, the digital archives, the museum archives that are also, even though they're curated, also embed a system of power in them as well. So I'll just sort of throw that there as a provocation, and that to represent the world is always a kind of social and political act, and that the photograph isn't just a neutral piece of data floating around that's somehow representative of the real world, as we see in like famous papers by Fay Faley, where she says about ImageNet, although every photographer has a bias, we thought we could erase and average out the bias through scale.
Yeah, and Amaya, I see you have your hand up, but this is also a great kind of plug for our generative sort of AI futures generative art demo, where we'll have artists and curators placing these outputs of these technologies in conversation with sort of histories of communities trying to tell progressive stories rooted in Afrofuturistic traditions, and sort of think about the possibilities of these technologies creating culturally situated stories and artifacts. So definitely stick around for that if possible. Maya, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just sort of plus oneing what Katrina said, and kind of maybe trying to build on that and maybe flesh out a little bit what I might mean by cultural and cultural literacy, which is, I think, a project, and visual literacy, which should go, I think, hand in hand with the creation of these kinds of tools. So because Katrina sort of mentioned photography, and I was thinking about that as well, and thinking to more recent times about debates and discussions about the role and place of the photographer. And I'm thinking specifically about the last 35 or 40 years of this situation, this complicated situation that arose when the famines in Africa, in Ethiopia and Sudan, and largely Western photographers, but also photojournalists taking pictures of the starving African to draw attention to what was happening there. But there was a real sort of problematic aspect to the capture of people's images, the sort of transmission of that image from the way the photographer, we don't know who the photographer is. You know, they get like a great byline in Time or Newsweek or something for this, you know, this image which upsets the Western world. But, you know, as a young person growing up in India, I definitely saw that as well. And, you know, it's not just also about the West. We have our own empires in other places also, and do our own kind of power plays in other places. So in that context, there's been a lot of pushback of saying, who is creating the image of first the starving African? And then when HIV/AIDS started to become a thing, there was also a lot of like strong visual documentation to draw attention to the need for fundraising and power, vulnerability in all of these situations. And there has been a lot of discussion about photography and and how photography has been implicated in this. And what has been sort of bothering me a lot recently is, why is there such a break in all of these quite recent histories and of image making that sort of don't speak to or are not part of the conversation in the development of image generation models? And maybe it's a little bit of what I said before, that, you know, I think these technologies have been created in almost like a bit of a, you know, crazy baking experiment. Like, let's see what happens if we do all of this stuff. And usually science kind of proceeds when we have like you have theory, you have problems you want to solve, you develop tools to address those problems. So I'm not sure what the problem is that image generation is solving. And I know it is solving specific models. I'm saying this, you know, also provocatively, because I would love to hear from the audience, but there are very specific problems that it solves. So it works in a really niche context and moment. And the problem is when we expand it out, and this is a little bit of this hubris of AI generally, where it's like, I can apply it everywhere. And I think like Yassine also kind of referred to this in talking about, you know, more niche applications or niche sort of contexts in which we would apply these tools. So we have recent histories of how complicated image making has become. And in the last 35 years, we've become deluged in images to the point where, ironically, we don't know how to talk about them anymore because they're just everywhere. And I feel like there was a moment in the 80s and 90s, and I'm dating myself here, when you did say, oh, a camera was a thing that you picked up. It was not in everybody's hands, you know, so it was not as ubiquitous. You could isolate and say, look, where's this image coming from? How is it being translated? You learned how to read images. So I feel like the literacy is not a literal literacy, but is sort of a cultural moment we need. And I think that those of us who are in different positions can kind of do this with each other in some ways. You know, it doesn't, I also push back against the idea that now we must tell, you know, all of the people making image generation models that they have to become like visual scholars or something like that. No, it's not going to happen. You know, I'm not going to make a model, and I have other skills and perspectives and practices that I can maybe share with these kinds of people. Me, you know, the collective me, all of us, but in more sort of focused ways. And maybe I'll come back to this later at the end when we kind of think about what does this actually look like in practice. But let me just leave it there for now, and yeah, love to hear from others. Or thanks.
Yeah. And I think I want to kind of like maybe, so I think we're, you know, running on time. I want to save the last like 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A also. If we sort of take a step back, and Maya, like picking up from where you left off, which was you don't want all of you know, of all model developers and ML researchers to become visual theorists, but there is something, you know, in this moment from this panel that we can all take away, and maybe we can all just kind of chat about that, right? Like, what are some of the things that we can do to reflect on and digest sort of the things that have come up from this panel. So Harshit, maybe you can start, and I particularly maybe would love to hear from you about the thing that you said sort of earlier about, you know, sort of raised a lot of things about sort of like the cultures of sharing and understanding cultural nuance and understanding cultural aesthetics and understanding the limits of AI technology. So should ML, like what should ML researchers be doing right now to think about that question about the possibility of what AI can represent culturally and understand culturally and what it can't?
Yeah, I mean, fascinating conversations, definitely. And I completely, I think, resonate with what Maya built towards the end of these ideas of niche working areas of AI ML, right? And maybe it's not meant to solve everything and paint everything with an AI brush, for example. And I think that those were the anecdotes, like stories with my mom, etc., that I was trying to sort of build a point about. And I think what is also really important is the context in which the images are consumed. So they're generated in a certain way, whatever, and someone else might have generated it. But especially in, let's say, an Indian context or South Asian context, for example, right? A lot of the consumption of images happens on individual platforms like WhatsApp, where you're consuming images directly and not in a cultural context. In social media, you're at least let's say, consuming images in a social context where there's enough like people who've written comments, etc., etc. So there's some kind of a cultural build up to that image that happens, and there's maybe some law of like averages that plays out, etc. But in contexts where there's sort of a direct streaming of content to an individual, I think it becomes really all the more important that these niche areas of what matters to these people is taken with utmost seriousness, and you ensure that content for that, for those areas is not created with AI until the point it is absolutely ready to actually create the right kind of content for that kind of context. So I think that is of utmost importance. I think, and until we have that kind of an understanding, we should be able to be okay with the fact that, you know, not everyone wants to generate or see images, or it's relevant for them to see images of, let's say, horses in outer space, for example, right? Which is sort of the poster image of generative AI. For people, that may not be the most relevant image to see, and the relevant images that these models do generate may not be correct for them, right? And they may not have the understanding that this is generated by an AI, and therefore it has certain limitations. So sort of the access for them is happening, but the knowledge of how it is actually working in the background is not happening. So I think until we reach at sort of the same level for both of those things, we should sort of make sure that we are very aware of the context in which we are letting generative AI spread images.
Yeah, I love that, thinking about what actually matters and how do people want to use these tools, as opposed to sort of presuming that this is assuming a universal culture of image sharing and image consumption and image production, which coincidentally looks very similar to the culture that we that we sort of live in as technology researchers. But I'd open it up to the panel also. Sort of, what are some of the leaving thoughts, like the sort of the thoughts that you'd leave machine learning researchers and practitioners with, in terms of thinking about cultural inclusion in their work, but also kind of broadening out the scope of the problem? Don't be shy, just like
I can go first. Think so. Maya mentioned something about not necessarily having every technology developer have full understanding of visual studies. It's kind of one of the things where absolutely, and we need to also find where are some things that we can require of people and where we can hold them accountable. And we're not going to get all developers to understand what inclusion means, but we can still agree on some basic things that they should steer away from. So that's going to be choices that they make that further marginalization, that further stereotypical representations, that like can be explained fairly quickly as long as there's an understanding that they're responsible for avoiding those. I'm going to bring it back for a minute to the very technical, where there are some things people can do without engaging with those questions that can help. So working on more data efficient techniques, working on, like, if you have technical skills, putting yourself in a service position of showing up at a hackathon and like helping people on their own projects that they have framed themselves. All of those things, like, again, it's about giving up the power of what it means to define inclusion, making it easier for other people to do it for themselves. Figure out what's best for you, because that's going to look very different based on every single person's skills.
Yeah, I love those like very specific practical things that researchers can do. Katrina or Maya, do you have thoughts?
You want to go first, Maya?
Yeah, no, go for it. I have something to say, but please go for it.
Well, I mean, a lot of the points that I was going to say have already been sort of said by my esteemed co-panelists. And I was really pleased to hear this current of against universalism. I think that a lot of the problems are about trying to create a universal model that can do everything. And with that comes all sorts of problems, as we've seen. to understand that you're not going to erase bias, and that you need to understand the power dynamics of whatever model, whatever data you're working with, in order to, work in a progressive way with it. And I think one of the most provocative things I can ever say to a machine learning researcher is, at least those that work with visual culture, is that for them to understand that they're curators and creators of image culture. They're building the visual culture of the future. And that's an incredibly powerful thing to imagine. And quite radical, actually, if I've seen people begin to think about their practice in the way. You are gathering, creating, like, if you're scraping data sets, you're gathering, you're curating, you're classifying, you're playing with the historical image language game, you're doing all these really, really significant things that scholars are grasping over. And here you are wandering in with all this technology and all this hype, doing all this fantastic stuff. So yeah, I think it's an impossible position to be in, but it's an amazing moment to collaborate with others and imagine what a progressive form of visuality might be, given the kind of colonial legacies of forms of representation historically. So it's an exciting moment, I think.
Maybe I could just build on this and also attempt something which may sound a bit radical, but is I'm quite serious in thinking about this and proposing this as something sort of practical. I feel that even the model that we have for dealing with the problems with these things are, maybe we can experiment with something else. So typically what happens is a technology is produced. There are some kinds of problems that emerge from it. We understand better about how to improve the system by understanding the harms and the problems and the ways that it breaks, and then we try to improve it and go on. But I feel like these also become these moments to sort of open up and say, what if we had a different approach to doing some niche projects with different kinds of stakeholders and publics? Now, I realize that, big tech companies can't stop making money. I mean, like, part of the tension is that, well, I can't do this because it kind of affects the bottom line. That's not going to change. So if you move that sort of argument off the table for a moment and think about, within that ecosystem, make spaces for research and practice, like really interesting critical research and practice with smaller, more flexible, interesting teams, working within the technology, working with people who are also outside it. And for instance, I'm very fascinated by the fact that you've got an entire global system of art, culture, music, and representation, which is Islam, which comes entirely from not being able to represent God. And a lot of the problems that have happened in the past, like cartoons and things like that, come from actually sort of pushing against this boundary that exists. And I feel like if we sort of took this issue, and there's going to be something like this which happens soon, when somebody, I mean, as I'm saying this as an Indian, but also in many other parts of the world, when you have these questions of representation coming up in cultures that are very expressly like, no, there are some things that you just don't do, but we have another visual language to represent this. What would a regulatory visual cultures, educational, but also kind of working with much larger communities of people who are already working within constraints, so it's not about erasing that bias or saying we need more sort of understanding of this particular culture. What would it mean to actually take sort of big, long-standing problems around speech and visual culture and say we need a different way to expand and explore them, developing regulatory and governance approaches along with cultural approaches as well. So I'm going to maybe just stop there because I think we're out of time, but I hope if somebody wants to talk about this, then please stay in touch.
Yeah, this was such a generative panel. I think the kind of like things we've ended at around, community agency, pushing against universalism, thinking about how we can hold researchers, developers accountable, thinking about, situated regulatory approaches and model building approaches that take seriously cultural specificity and particular cultural approaches that take seriously what particular communities want from visual cultures and cultural and their cultural aesthetics. I think these are all such powerful things for all of us to think about. So we are unfortunately out of time. I wish I could just keep on learning from all of you forever, basically, but we have been constrained by the power of the clock. But thank you so much, all of you, and really just a special shout out to all our panelists for making this work virtually across multiple time zones. Katrina, I know you have stayed up to like 2 a.m. Your time for this. So that's incredible dedication to this cause, and just we're so grateful. So just like great, maybe we can all just unmute and give a great big round of applause to our panelists. And please feel free to reach out to us if you want to be put in touch, or maybe if the panelists are comfortable with people reaching out with questions, we can keep the conversation going. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I'll just pass it over to our in-person organizers now. We have a little bit of a break, and then I think we're going to come back for our paper spotlight sessions, which will then be followed by a generative art demo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a hot topic. We're right in the middle of it. It's a double-edged sword for sure. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed.
Okay.
Do you want me to go?
So let me introduce you. So for our spotlight talks, we're going to start with Sarah, who's going to present us with safety and fairness for content moderation in generative models. So please, Sarah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Are there remote participants still?
Yes.
There are? Okay. So I'm going to hold the microphone. And they can hear me. Or no? Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, yes. So I am Sarah Laszlo. I'm a research scientist in the responsible AI area of Google Research. And I'm going to talk about this paper, Safety and Fairness for Content Moderation and Generative Models. This was a collaborative effort between myself, Susan Howe, who's here and will be presenting the poster later, and a bunch of other people at Google Research. I want to thank Mohammed, Ziad, and all of the remote organizers for organizing this, and actually the panelists, because they keyed my first slide up perfectly. In fact, I believe Katrina talked about the thing on the left, which is over-sexualization in Lensa. So thanks to the panelists. If everyone in this room didn't already know this, we now know that generative AI can be used in harmful ways. So on the left is a story from The Guardian about this result in Lensa, that women tend to be sexualized, over-sexualized in the Lensa app. And on the right is reporting from the Washington Post about how AI generated imagery is being used to amplify harassment of women, in particular with revenge porn. In addition to that somewhat salacious reporting in the popular press, there's also a growing scholarly literature about how generative imagery can be harmful. So broadly, we can characterize the literature as showing evidence for generative imagery amplifying stereotypes, amplifying tech-facilitated violence like bullying, and even amplifying societal harms like the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation. Some of you may have seen an example of the latter. There's tons of these examples, but here's a recent one as reported on in The Verge. Ron DeSantis, who's if you're not American, he's a governor of Florida. He's Donald Trump's main competition for the Republican presidential nomination. He made these generated images of Donald Trump embracing Anthony Fauci, who is kind of a Republican bugaboo due to his role during the COVID pandemic. So pretty bad stuff that malicious actors, which I guess includes Ron DeSantis, can do with generative imagery. As content moderators, which is part of my job, but also as content creators, which I know we have a lot of people in the workshop that are creators rather than moderators, we would like to protect our users and the people that consume our content from all of these harms. And the question that we address in the paper is, how can we do this? How can we protect our users from these harms in a data-driven way? So to do this, the first step that we define is a harms framework. We can't protect users from harm if we don't know what harm is. In setting out a harms framework, we followed Google's AI principles. So we define safety harms as those that have evident capacity to cause egregious harm to our users. And included in that, in this paper, we investigated sexually explicit content, graphic violence and gore, and hateful content. And we distinguish safety harms from fairness harms, which are those that amplify demeaning stereotypes or cause patterns of erasure due to absences in the training data. And in this paper, we defined fairness harms as those where representation was not diverse, where people from different identity groups were not treated equally, where stereotypes were amplified, and where counterfactual fairness was not observed, which is essentially another way to examine whether people of different identity groups are treated differently. Okay. With the harms framework defined, we can start to take measurements. So in this paper, we generated 40,000 images from 10,000 adversarially sourced prompts, so 4 images per prompt. We were able to annotate the generated images with machine classifiers. In particular, for what I'm going to talk about today, we annotated for sexually explicit images, violent images, images that included hate symbols, and gender presentation of people in the images. And then with those measurements, we were able to compute descriptive and also inferential statistics, such as the safe rate for images, including different, in this case, gender presentations, completion rate, so how often the task was completed for people with different identities, confidence intervals on all the statistics, entropy of representation, and the mutual information criterion. All of this is a lot. The full thing, we posted it on arXiv. Susan and our collaborator, Renee Shelby, did this. Here's the arXiv link if you're so inclined. This generated a lot of data. So all these annotations, all these statistics on 40,000 images is a lot. I don't have time to talk about that all, so I'm just going to focus on one analysis that we did looking at gender presentation as it interacts with prompt type. I chose this as a representative analysis to talk about because it covers both safety and fairness. We identify prompts that are unsafe, either because they're sexually explicit or because they're violent, and then we look at how the resultant images differ on the basis of gender presentation. So that's a fairness issue. Okay, we discovered, unsurprisingly, that overall, across the entire 40,000 images, it was more likely to, I should have started this, the prompts that we're going to look at in this analysis did not mention gender. So these are all gender neutral prompts. Across all of the gender neutral prompts, you don't mention gender, you're much more likely to get a masculine gender presentation in an image. However, if you look at only the subset of prompts which are sexually explicit, this imbalance flips, and now all of a sudden you get more feminine leaning gender presentations in the images. And then if you look at the violent subset, only the violent subset of prompts, the gender presentation flips again, and now you tend to get images that are more masculine leaning. Okay. So with this data in hand, we were ready to make a content moderation recommendation because that was the original goal of this at the start, was to use all this data to figure out how to moderate the content when it comes out so it's as safe, as fair as possible. And what we ended up recommending in this case is that when a sexually explicit or violent prompt is detected, that we enforce a gender entropy criterion per prompt. And what that means is that when images are generated, if there is a gender presentation disparity, some of the images from the overbalanced gender are discarded and then regenerated until a gender parity is achieved, or within some threshold that the content moderator can set of gender parity. Okay, so returning to the question that I asked at the start, how can we protect our users from harms in a data-driven way? This example that I've just walked you through is our suggestion for one way to do this. So start by defining what you mean by harm, what we mean by harm as content moderators. Second, take measurements. We can't do anything that is data-driven without measurements. So take measurements, compute statistics is step 2. And then on the basis of those statistics, make a content moderation recommendation. So in this case, as I just walked you through, we recommended that you enforce a gender entropy criterion per prompt. Okay, that's it. I talked really fast because I had coffee before and because the panelists set me up so well by talking about half of what I was going to talk about in the talk. So that's all I have to say. Hopefully there's not a lot of us here. We can have a little chat now with the extra time if you want. If you want to read more of the details, the paper is on arXiv. Here is the link. I don't know what, I hallucinated this poster number because this is not the actual poster number, but Susan is here. She has a poster. It's what, like 8 feet wide? So it's easy to find. It's easy to find if you want to find it in our workshop poster. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, are there any questions?
Any questions? Yes.
Maybe can you go to the
I can repeat it too. Whatever you want.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for the interesting presentation.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, what was your? I understand the motivation for balancing the genders in, for example, sexual content. But what is your motivation in achieving balancing things like hateful content or violence content?
Yeah.
Because those, naively speaking, those things are inherently bad.
Yeah.
So why is balance there even an issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question was, why try to achieve gender parity in hateful and violent content? Those are bad we should probably just not generate that at all, not try to achieve gender parity. Is that a fair summary? Yes. So first of all, I think to you and me and probably many of the people in this room, it's clear that the violent and hateful content is just bad and we shouldn't generate it. But unfortunately, you would not encounter that attitude as a majority amongst the developers of these models. So we encounter a lot of resistance in saying that. And so when we encounter that resistance, we try to create something. We try to have some solution that people can use, even if they want to be very like, we're not going to block content. We're going to be free speech advocates. We're going to generate whatever the user wants to generate, whatever prompt they want to generate. In that case, we have to offer them something that is fair. So that's part of the reason. Another part of the reason is that violent content doesn't necessarily have to mean like, you know, someone getting murdered. Something can score a moderate violence that maybe we would want to generate. So maybe we want to generate something like people playing, actually I've seen tons of images of people playing rugby, and maybe these might score as being somewhat violent. I've never watched a rugby game live, but the images look like they could be a little bit violent to me. And we'd still want to generate those. We still want to generate people playing rugby. We still want to generate people playing football. We still want to generate maybe kids playing on the playground. And so when those things happen, we still want to have people of all genders represented. The hate, yeah, we did, the hate, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe we just want to block the hate. I think that would certainly be a reasonable position to take. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you for asking.
Yes, you're welcome. Yes.
Can I follow up with that?
Of course.
Happy for you to repeat.
Yeah.
The rugby example is a really interesting one.
Yeah.
Rugby is majority played by men.
Yeah.
Women's teams exist.
Yeah.
The English women's rugby team is incredible.
Yeah.
But should not the output represent the majority of data coming in?
Yeah.
You'd expect 95% men in your output images.
Of rugby players. Yeah. This is a great question. So the question was, there are, I gave an example of rugby as something that's potentially violent that we might still want to generate rather than just blocking it. And the follow-up question was, why should we have gender parity in rugby images? Because in fact, most rugby players are men, although there are some exceptional female rugby players. Is that a fair restating?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I was able to restate that because I hear that a lot. We also hear it a lot with something that's in the previous talks that I've given. I personally, two of my identities are I am a woman and I am a tech worker. And so often the example I'll use in talks like this is the one that's well known of like, if you ask for a software engineer, you'll get majority light-skinned male representing people. And I will say, well, I don't like that. Like, that doesn't represent me. I don't see myself there. But then I will hear a reasonable statement like what was just made of, yeah, but that's true. Like they're actually most software engineers are light-skinned men. So do we want to represent what's true? Or do we want to represent what's equitable? And I don't think we have an answer to that. I think that I don't know. I don't know what we should do. I think maybe part of what we should do is listen to the panelists who talked about like maybe there isn't maybe we can't come to a universal answer here. Like we can't actually say in all cases there should be gender parity because in some cases maybe there shouldn't be. Like we shouldn't have maybe we shouldn't have gender parity in rugby because most rugby players are men. Same with professional football in the United States. I think like American football. So like the hand egg. in professional hand egg in the United States, most, I think like 99.9 or 100% of the players are men. So maybe we don't need to have gender parity when we present professional football. I think, yeah, so I think there's not a clean answer. I think maybe it goes to what the panelists were talking to about not seeking universal answers. And I think it's a reasonable question that we hear a lot. That's my answer. It's not a very good one because the answer is kind of like, I don't know. At the end.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Sorry, we're out of time for questions. We'll. Okay, so for the next presentation, we have Jan. Is that the correct pronunciation of your name?
Yes.
Okay. For towards more realistic membership inference attacks on large diffusion models. Thank you. Let me see if I can make it full screen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jan, and I would like to talk about the challenge of creating a fair evaluation setup for membership inference problems for large diffusion models. First, let's start by stating that diffusion models are now state-of-the-art image generators, and those kind of models are able to turn a text prompt into a remarkable image. However, this technical wonder, as we know, has many dark sides, and one of them being is that such models are trained on very large data sets, often containing billions of images. And so it happens that such data sets often violate the copyrights of organizations and even worse, individuals such as photographers or artists. And in this setting, another natural question arises. Can we identify if a data sample S was used in training a particular model? And can we do it without trusting the model creator to provide information about the training data? Can we just do it using the model? And such questions are named, this problem is named in the literature as membership inference. And this problem can be solved by the so-called membership inference attack. And in those kind of attacks, you choose a data sample S, you query a particular model M with that sample, you analyze the output and the behavior of the model, and then you make a decision. Either you classify the sample as a member, so it was part of the training set, or as a non-member, which means that this particular model was not trained on this data sample. And before I discuss the attack method that we use, let's briefly describe how diffusion models work. So in principle, diffusion models are trained by first running the forward diffusion process, so iteratively noising the image. And then the generation is done by training a neural network to iteratively remove the added noise step by step. And in this work, we focus on stable diffusion, which is a very large generative diffusion model. And it introduces two major modifications to that concept. First and foremost is a latent diffusion model, which means the diffusion process is done in the latent space, not in the pixel space of images. And you have very powerful conditioning control with embeddings from large language model. And we have chosen that model because it's available open source. And membership inference attacks are based on this simple but fundamental fact that machine learning models minimize their loss on the training data, so on the member set. And using this observation, we can identify members and no members. We calculate a defined loss of some kind, and if the loss is lower than a selected threshold, we assign member label to the sample, so it was in the training data. And if it's higher than the threshold, well, it's a non-member. The model has not seen this during training. And in this paper, we run this attack from the angle of the noise predicting by the neural network, all the difference between images images that are generated by the diffusion model, or since we are working with stable diffusion, we attack this problem from the angle of differences in latent space representation. However, and this is the main point of the paper, how can we design a fair evaluation for such attacks? Because this is, as we found out, this is a challenge. So naturally, we need member, so in training set, and non-member out of the training set samples.
And usually you just take member samples from the training data and non-member, and you use test data as non-members. But for those large diffusion models, the data is either not public, or as is the case in stable diffusion, the whole body of data was used for training. There is nothing left by the authors as a natural testing set. And this made this whole setting very challenging. So maybe we can take this model, train it from scratch again, and this time leaving part of the data as test set. Well, here we are limited by the cost of such a training, which is over $100,000. So it's not doable in practice. Another approach that's common in the literature is to take this trained model and fine-tune it on a limited data set in which you can have train and test set easily controlled. But this procedure makes the membership attack easier. And actually, we are not evaluating the true model that's widely used by the community, by people around the world. We are just creating another piece of our paper, some analysis, but it's not the model that's really used. And finally, we may try to find new data which we can use as non-members. But here is the trick. We need to make absolutely sure that this data comes from the same distribution as the data that was used for training. And if this condition is not met, this may be the case that our attack will learn to differentiate between those two data sources and not actually between what was in the training set and not. And in the case of stable diffusion, which we analyzed, this model was trained on the Lion data set, which contained roughly 5 billion samples. And stable diffusion 1.4 was trained on this Lion 2BN dataset subset, and it contains images with English captions. This is the entire body of images with English captions scrapped from the internet, and it was used for training. And coincidentally enough, the authors of this data set also released, not short after, Lion 2B multi, which contains images with caption, machine translated to English. So and those images were not used in training any of those models. But here's the catch. We need to meet this condition that I described. And if captions are machine generated, machine translated, there have been many papers on the fact that they are different from the captions that are written by humans. So we need to run this filtering process to make sure that these two data generations are the same. And here is how it looked like. In the top row, you can see two principal components of the latent representations of the captions. And yeah, in blue, you have members, and in orange, you have non-members. And see, in first, they do not align very well. So it's trivial to distinguish between those two groups, really. But after enough filtering, and we are filtering the no-member candidates, those two different distributions are very well aligned, and we can easily differentiate which data sample is coming from Lion English and which from Lion Multi. And with the data set for evaluation created in such a way, we have run our attack experiments. And there are two setups presented here. One is adapt Pokemon, and this is like a classic toy example of incorrect setting, because we have fine-tuned the model on a very limited data set, less than 1,000 samples. We have done very extensive training of the stable diffusion model for many time steps. And the other column in setting Dapt Lion, this is our proposed evaluation setup, which we think is fair and rigorous. And the main observation that I want to show here, this is a receiver, this is the ROC curve. So the higher we are, the farther we are from the dotted line, the better our classifier is. And please take a look for those orange and red lines for the Pokemon setting. All our methods, which are in fact really, really simple, they achieve almost perfect performance. It's trivial to distinguish between members and non-members. However, when we do the same attacks in our setting, LionMe, we achieve a true positive rate a little bit over 2.5. So this graph is in a log scale, so you can see how hard is it to actually identify which samples were used in the training set. And the main takeaway of this talk that I want to convey to you is that it's hard to do a fair evaluation for those setups. And definitely fine-tuning, in our opinion, is not the answer. And we should just try to make settings for such problems as realistic as possible, because in the internet, in the community, people are not using those small generative models fine-tuned on data sets like FNIST or Cypher. They are using those large models that train of millions of images scrapped from the internet. And we would like to propose a setting which in our opinion is fair and rigorous enough to be treated as a benchmark for those kind of problems. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and if you have any questions regarding that matter, I will gladly answer them.
So we actually don't have time for questions. Sorry, we're like 2 minutes over the scheduled time. But if please keep your questions for the poster session after the break. So for the next presentation, we're going to have Ludovica present her work. So if you hear me, can you share your screen and do the presentation? Maybe I should stop presenting and then so you can.
So I started sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
That's okay. And can you hear me all right?
Yes,
all right.
Yes, we could hear you. So I'll mute so you could.
All right, so I'll try to be a bit quicker. So today we'll present a project that we carried out as a lab for the biennial in Helsinki from this year, which actually opened about 2 weeks ago. And the project is, in a nutshell, a art curation using AI tools. And as I'll kind of hopefully convey in the rest of the talk, the project uses artistic curation as a means to reflect on what is the lens that AI applies to art, and also how we can use AI to recontextualize the collection and the art, and in our particular case, how we can use it to inhabit the city of Helsinki. And we are the Digital Visual Studies team. We are a group funded by the Max Planck Society and hosted at the University of Zurich. And we mostly focus on art and architectural history with means of digital humanities and computer vision, of course. So for this project, we use the Hum Collection, which is an online platform displaying about 10,000 works by the Helsinki Museum of Art. And they contain primarily Finnish art in the form of paintings, sculptures, drawings, and installations. And something that will be kind of important for the rest of the talk is that this collection is split into public art, which is spread across the city of Helsinki, and of which we have the coordinates inside the city, and art, which is inside the museum collection, and which we will from now on refer to as the indoor art. So differently from a digital collection like the one you've seen, we believe that an AI curation should offer different aspects. And one of these is a narration offered from one perspective, in this case, the one of the machine, so to say, and offering a new experience of discoveries, but also of meaning. So our first step in this project was to try to have an agnostic distant viewing, as of course we don't really know much being from Zurich of finished art. And the first thing we did is to read the collection through the eyes of Clip. And in particular, we used Clip Interrogator to obtain a textual and a visual embedding of each image, and we concatenated them to create a representation of the image for us. And of course, we know that this agnostic distant viewing that we so much want from machines is, in the end of the day, still reading the collection through another collection and through the distorted eyes of Clip and of the common crawl with its own cultural meaning. So we use these representations of the images to imagine a location in Helsinki of those artworks which were inside the museum collection, so the indoor artworks. And we did this in sort of a kind of triangulation way, we call this. So we gathered the 3 most similar public artworks using the representation that we obtained in 2 slides before. And for the 3 most similar public artworks, we retrieved their coordinates and we kind of centered the location of the indoor artwork at the center of the triangle that we, in this way, created. So what we did here is basically we populated the city with the indoor artworks, which are here represented in blue, in addition to the red artworks, which were the public artworks, which were already in the city. And in this way, kind of these indoor artworks exit the walls of the museum and they start inhabiting the squares and the streets of Helsinki. So what we did is basically we created this new stratum of reality in Helsinki, which is a machinic urban landscape where the local artists of the ham are inhabiting the local context of the city, so only of the capital of Helsinki, which is in itself biased. And then we, from all the locations that we extracted and the ones we already had, we retrieved the 360 view of that location, and we retrieved the depth map using basically minus off the shelf. And as I said before, we also use Clip Interrogator to obtain a text from the original image. So through all these models, we finally use stable diffusion using control net to create a panorama where the features are the features of the original artwork as they're understood by the machine, but they inhabit sort of the depth of the original panorama. And this is not going to the next slide. So in the end of the day, we believe in a way we made the AI an agent, which is mediating and recreating the content of the collection. It's adding new values, new meanings, but it's also forgetting a lot of the original meanings of these artworks, and this we should not forget. So for us, in the end of the day, this artistic curation was none else than what we call the modular stack of models and human actions. And this made us reflect on that series of distorted lenses that we are applying to reality, and how it's kind of necessary that we at least try to disentangle these factors. And this basically last discussion slide is more to show how there are so many steps and it's so hard to go through all of these and understand that every point in which our final object is no longer representing the original works and the original art culture of the city of Helsinki. And with this, I leave you. And the final basically website that we created can be seen here through the QR code if you're interested. And otherwise, I don't know if we have time, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. I think we have 2 minutes for questions, if there are questions. From the audience as well. Okay, so if there's no questions, or people are thinking about the questions they can ask you at the poster session. It's a very great work. Thank you for presenting
Thank
it.
you so much.
So for the next presenter, I think we have Abibska. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm.
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you could share your screen, perhaps.
Yeah. Yes, sure. Just give me a second.
Sure.
Again, my laptop is also new, so yeah.
Okay, so I'll mute, and then whenever you're ready, you could start the presentation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So you can start anytime. We don't hear you if you're speaking.
Hello? Hello,
Yes,
am
we
I
hear.
audible?
Yes, we hear you now. Are you able to share your screen?
Hello?
Hello.
Am I
Hi.
audible?
Yes. Do you hear us?
Sorry for the delay. Yeah. I'll just start very quickly.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So, okay. So, hi everyone. I'm happy to present our talk, Inspecting Geographical Representativeness of Images from Text to Image Models. Now, we are all fascinated by the recent text to image models. And as they are being deployed for the common people, multiple researchers are studying these models for hateful generations, biases against a certain race, gender, culture, and so on. As you can see in these examples, and also somebody pointed out just this same example, that if you ask Stable Diffusion to generate images of software engineers working with a laptop, it always generates sort of male whitish images. The situation with DALI 2 is a little bit better, but we still need to do a lot of analysis on this front, how biased these models are. However, in this work, we focus on an often overlooked aspect of geographical inclusivity. So consider this particular prompt, high definition image of a house. We want to see what these models do when generating images involving different objects or surroundings. Note that this particular prompt does not specify any particular country or location. It's absolutely neutral of the location. Do the generations now overrepresent some countries in the globe, or do they underrepresent some countries? Or are they kind of like equally representative of the different nations around the world? That is the question that we want to ask in this project. Now, why is this aspect of geographical inclusivity so important? So text to image models can be used for data augmentations and bias generations like these. When combined with the original data sets, the biases may flow into the neural network used to train these data sets, and that may lead to an amplification of the biases. Secondly, you can also see that suppose this girl who lives in India and her surrounding looks something like this, the below the left image here. She is querying the model for an image of a house, and she is getting some image like this, which she is unable to relate to completely. So that leads to a very bad user experience, which we should avoid. That's why we think that geographical inclusivity is one very important aspect that should be talked about. To evaluate how geographically representative these models are, we generate images of common nouns like city, beach, house, and so on from two popular generative models, DALI 2 and Stable Diffusion. Then we reach out to crowd workers from a certain country C from using these two platforms, and we ask these people to rate the generated images. So from both the models. Half of these generated images are created without specifying any country name in the prompt. Others are generated by specifying that we only want images from this particular country C. Now, after this, we ask the evaluators, how well does the automatically generated image of this noun, for example, house, reflect the houses in your surroundings in country C, suppose India. And we ask the evaluators to respond on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not at all and 5 being to a great extent. We repeat this experiment on 27 countries from around the world, where each we randomly select 20 participants per country. We summarize the resulting findings by averaging the rated scores across nouns and participants. So in this particular slide, we show the more interesting case of underspecified prompts for both the models. We find that for both cases, only 2 countries out of the 27, that is US and India, are able to exceed the 3-point mark, which is the midpoint of the 1 to 5 scale. All others are below, and some like these, the bottom ones, they are even below 2. This strongly supports our assumption that the default generations do overrepresent certain countries more and underrepresent a few as well. Here, the results are sorted according to the scores that the evaluators gave for DALI 2. You can see that very often there's a mismatch in the scoring between the DALI 2 images and the stable diffusion images. For a particular country, sometimes participants prefer DALI 2 images over stable diffusion images, and the opposite is also very true. However, you can, when we statistically try to compare these scores, we do not find any significant difference. For images generated by prompts that specify the country names, the scores improve in all cases as given by the green bars. But the improvement is not same for all the countries. The scores for DALI 2, you can see they are visibly higher, but only for 3 countries they are over 4. For stable diffusion, the scores are not that high, and for some cases, the scores are even lower than 3, signaling that even when you tell the model to generate images specific to a country, the user satisfaction isn't as high, leaving a large scope for improvement. We also look for relationships between the photorealism of the generated images and their geographical representativeness. We find that these two concepts are actually positively correlated as per the participants of the countries that we have explored. Details of our findings can be found in the paper, and interested people can go through it. We also want to explore multiple ways to automate the evaluation process, as involvement of humans is expensive and cumbersome, but all the methods that we try out turn out to be inadequate. So this calls for more research in this area, as automatically evaluating geographical representativeness is challenging. Finally, let's look at some examples. So we present examples for the noun house, particularly in these slides. The first column shows the underrepresented generations, while the other shows the generation specific to some countries. For both models, we see that the generations, suppose of India, Japan, Italy, they change drastically once we just mention the country name in the prompt. So the default ones look very similar, and they are pretty westernized in structure, whereas just by mentioning the country name, we can see that for the 2 Asian countries, the structures of the houses have changed a lot, whereas for this European country also there's substantial change. So coming to some of the limitations of this study, we would have liked more participation from the marginalized countries, or probably from countries belonging to Asia and Africa more, for better accurate evaluation of geographical representativeness. Moreover, in this study, we are exploring 10 commonly occurring nouns only. So with these 10 common nouns, we see that our survey already consists of 80 images per participant, which is itself pretty long. And if we had increased the number of nouns, that would have led to maybe noisier surveys. But we welcome future researchers to conduct larger scale studies that would involve more nouns in order to get more insights about how the real geographical representativeness of these models. Also, the last thing that I would like to point out is that we do not account for the diversity of nouns inside a specific country. So as an Indian, I know that houses, the structure of houses in India differ from in every corner of the country. So we do not take into account this diversity inside a country. To do that, we urge researchers to conduct studies that are done at a much finer granularity, like for example, states, cities, villages, and so on. We believe that we would get more insights about the overrepresentation of the countries that we showed some slides back by these models if we closely explored the open source training data available. For example, Lion is one example that one of the speakers showed. And we can analyze the distribution of the different objects and the countries in order to understand how this particular training data is influencing the model's outputs, whether the models are exactly replicating those distributions or whether the bias is getting amplified. We should also collect and augment more data for the underrepresented countries. And also, the most important thing would be to increase participation of such marginalized countries so that we can more accurately evaluate geographical representativeness. So interested people can go through our paper. So we have given the archive link for it. Thank you so much. And extremely sorry for the trouble caused just now. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. Please keep your questions for the poster session, even though I have questions myself. But so it's time for break. Please be back at 10:20. We have we have another plan, a panel planned. So yeah, we'll see you soon.
Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Pamela. Yes, I can. I can hear you.
Hello.
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Yes.
Put myself on mute.
The folks in the room are taking a coffee break right now and poster session, so that's why we're all sitting here silently.
That's okay. I'll
Hey.
Hello. Hi.
Do you hear us? Can somebody say something?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great.
While we wait, can I just check that I can share my slides? It's not an issue.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Works. Thank you.
No problem.
Hi, Mohammed, Ziad, and Sarah. Could you just let us know when we can start? When the people have sort of come back from the coffee break?
Sure. So yeah, I think they'll be here soon. I said 10:20. Yeah, I said 10:20. So maybe wait like what, 2 more minutes, one, 2 more minutes.
I don't know. Is anyone there in the Vancouver room? And if yes, can you hear us?
There's 3 of us here. So
Okay.
yeah, you could start since we have a tight schedule, and then
Okay, sounds good. Okay, Pamela, handing it over to you. Pamela, I don't know, you're mute, so I don't know if you're around. Okay, hi all. I don't know, I think we might have lost Pamela for a bit, but we'll wait for her to come back. In the meantime, I will go ahead and introduce our generative AI futures panel and demo, which we're really, really excited about. Oh, Pamela, are you here? Because we can't hear you.
Sorry, I just realized my speakers were off. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, please go ahead. We'll pass it over to you. I was just stepping in for you.
Ah, super. Thank you, and sorry about that little failure. So yes, welcome everyone to our panel discussion on opportunities and challenges for culturally situated storytelling. We've got a really great group of artists and cultural producers to help us explore this question. And my name is Pamela. I manage a program at Google Arts and Culture. that is for artists in residence. And I'm also exploring some of these themes as a student of AI ethics at Cambridge University. And so I'll be your moderator for the session, and I'm really excited to get started. A little bit of context. This session is hosted by 3 groups at Google. So first of all, we have the AMI research program, which is a program dedicated to building and sustaining fields for creative practitioners working with machine learning. And it's a collaboration between research and Google Arts and Culture. The lab at Google Arts and Culture brings artists and technologists together to explore creative applications of emerging technologies. And we're really grateful to our colleagues in the Responsible AI and Human-Centered Technologies team who have created the space for artists to be present and to share their perspectives at CVPR this year. So a special shout out to Rita and the rest of the team for creating this moment. So since 2016, our respective programs have supported artists around the world to research, develop, produce, and ambitious artistic applications of machine learning research. But 2 programs have really inspired the conversation today. So the first is, sorry, I just realized I'm not moving my slides. The first is Generative Film Futures, which is an AMI program that invites filmmaking communities to critically engage with media generation tools. They were most recently present at the Black Star Film Festival. And the second is Open Lab Africa, which is a collaboration between Google Arts and Culture and Wits University in Johannesburg, which invited 10 artists across Africa to share perspectives on language as culture and technology through their work, exploring different themes of NLP research from text generation to multilinguality. And I've had the pleasure of leading this program with Dr. Tegan Bristow, who is one of our panelists today. So what are the opportunities for and limitations of generative AI for culturally situated storytelling? Generative AI represents a shift in who creates culture and how it's created. It represents a change in how we represent our lived realities. And so we're exploring these questions in that context. But what does culturally situated storytelling actually mean? What do we mean by that? Put quite simply, it's about stories that reflect who we are, what things are, and what they mean to us. In short, we don't see things as they are, we see them kind of as we are, and we're all products of different cultures. And this is evident in all of the sorts of words and symbols and images and artifacts that mean very different things across very different cultural contexts. I was thinking about this as I was looking at the Google Arts and Culture platform and searched for the term kind of a traditional hat and came across all of these different images. This is just a very small curation. I highly recommend having a look for yourself. But the story kind of that was revealed through looking at all of these is, as I said, that very particular words, very particular artifacts mean very different things across very different personal contexts. And so today we have 3 artists and 3 cultural producers to kind of help us navigate and explore these questions. First of all, we have Ari Melanciano, who's an artist, creative technologist, and researcher. And we also have the filmmaker and writer Dilman Dilla. And then we also have Dr. Tegan Bristow, who is a senior lecturer at the Wits School of Arts. So I'm going to hand off first to Ari. All of the panelists today have very extensive, very impressive accolades, which I'm not going to do justice. But I'll start off with Ari. So Ari is an artist, technologist, and researcher. She's also a cultural theorist. She's exploring kind of computational anthropology through her practice and is also an academic and teacher of many courses, including the Emerging Technologies program at NYU. As the founder of Afrotectopia, she is leading a cultural institution that is imagining, researching, and building at the nexus of new media art through a Black and Afrocentric lens. Ari is also a former colleague, so it's really great to have you, to see you actually, Ari, and I'll hand over to you for your own kind of perspective on the question that we're exploring today.
Thank you, Pamela. It's great to see you too. It's been a while. So I'm going to, yes, I am going to, so when I saw 10 minutes for one project, I'm like, okay, what can I share that encompasses what I feel like is fitting? And so this might feel like it's a few different projects, but it's really one project, and I promise I'll keep it in 10 minutes. But I'll start off by kind of labeling this as dualities of AI, and that's pretty much how I've been exploring the work with this emerging form of artificial intelligence. And so I see it both in two different ways, both using generative AI as an inquiry tool, for a research tool, but also generative AI as a creative tool. And so I feel like this is a really encompassing tweet that went viral months ago, but is really the pillar of why this is what it is today. And the reason why all of this is exploding so much, as we all know, is because of the accessibility, but the accessibility that's rooted in language. And when I thought very critically about what it is that language means, language in the way that it interacts with our daily life, it controls and dictates and allows us to define our ways of being and our ways of thinking, both in tandem of understanding this is the way that we are able to perceive the world, because this is the values that are embedded inside of language. And so when we go further, then that also means that language is then deciding what our culture is, psychology, perception, expression, identification, standards, what's subjectivity, what's objectivity, truth, representation, meaning, symbolism, value, identity. Entirely the world, the external world in which we live in, is all rooted in this idea of language. And so for me, I thought a lot about, okay, well, if this rooted in language, it's not necessarily bad or good. There's not like a duality in that sense, but if it is rooted in a language that's so specific to a small amount of people, which is generally where we are, most of us in the United States, but then also how it's the small amount of people that are inside of the tech labor force, and thinking about the demographics within that space, but then also having previously been inside of the labor force, of how this demographic is not even representative of who's actually deciding how language is controlling the way that we understand and create imagery. So for me, it was really important to reflect on that and understand what does that mean, but also to find alternatives. And so one thing that I share with my students a lot is this book by Miriam Ba'ani called Yurugu. And so this book fascinatingly really breaks down this idea of understanding the world and the world that we live in. And by creating an alternative, it allows us to realize that the way that we think is not actually the only way to think, and it's not factual, it's not objective, it's just an opinion. And so this one thing that it does is it breaks down this idea of being a knower, which is really this removal of spirituality when you think and are cerebral, or this idea of what is fact, and that is reality minus the meaningfulness, or what is object, and that is the phenomena or the experience minus the interconnected context. And so what it does is it really shows how this idea of reason and logic is very void of emotion and intuition and spirituality. But that is just one opinion, and that's not necessarily how we have to operate. And so that was the pillar for the foundation for how I explored generative AI in my first phase of using it as a tool for research, but also artistic expression. So I'll breeze past these because I want to keep on time, but what I started off doing was uploading a headshot that I had, and then I would prompt it with different words and see how it would render me differently based on its assumption of what that word means in conjunction with my identity. And so what I realized is it's not so much that this is, I wasn't doing it to reflect reality. I was more doing it to understand what this computer, which I use anonymously for AI and a whole bunch of other stuff, what this machine understands for these different ideas and identities and attributes. And so to see it render me differently based off the way that it has source imagery online and paired it with language, and how what is rising to the top, what are the tropes and what are the stereotypes. And of course, one of the most jarring is how it changed both my race and gender for programmer in the bottom left corner when I am a programmer. So it's not more of using this as a mirror to reality. It's more of a mirror to society and the way that we understand ourselves. And I would also bring in other identities, like beyond words and attributes, but also what does it mean to blend myself with entire beings that have existed and have a whole lot of identity encompassed within them. And what does it maintain of my identity, and what does it remove when they blend us together? So if I'm blended with Michelle Obama, how it knows that Michelle Obama typically takes imagery and her public identity is very joyful, smiling with her teeth, versus Oprah Winfrey probably would never put a middle part in her hair, like the small nuances and the ways that we have presented ourselves to online society. And so what I did was I turned all of this into an essay and shared it online back in November. And a lot of people got very excited about thinking about AI, not just as this tool for what we quickly assume to be AI art, but really this tool to reflect the ways that we understand the world and also the ways that we understand ourselves and how to study ourselves from the metadata that exists online of content around us. And so went further and also went into the public domain and grabbed imagery from there, used the captions from the public domain's images, and then put it back into generative tools like Stable Diffusion and saw how are you able to render images just based off the caption and see how close it could get to the original image. And a lot of fascinating things were revealed. For one, on the left, you see Benjamin Pap Singleton, and that all I did was use the caption of how he was described and saw how it would feed back to me different images that they assumed would be like Benjamin Pap Singleton. And the aesthetics were very similar to the type of film that was used in the 1880s, but the phenotypical features of Benjamin Pap weren't consistent with the outputs. Of Benjamin Pap is phenotypically a Black man, but the men that it produced were not. They phenotypically looked more European. And so what it could understand and what it could not understand. And then also moments where I would add additional context, like upload images of locations and say, these are the people that would have taken the photos, or these are the platforms that would have taken the photos, and how it changes the images based off that. So if I say in a travel magazine versus in a Red Cross pamphlet, it will romanticize images from a travel magazine versus look less desirable in a charitable organization like a Red Cross pamphlet if it's taken by a white photographer versus a Black photographer based on the location in which the subjects would exist within, like in the middle image with Ethiopia. Usually you would see the faces of the subjects if it's taken by an African photographer, but if it's taken by a European or white photographer, you would see the backs or it would be candid. And for me, this recognized the moment of voyeurism and understanding the comfort between a photographer and their subject. And even for understanding identity. So what does it mean for me to use this in a way to understand who I am and how I present myself into this world? And so I definitely had a little too much fun in my alter ego of being this sort of like audience and blending all these different images, creating this whole alternative life for myself where I was a supermodel in Egypt and flying on my own private jet and drinking champagne off Amalfi Coast and just studying the way that it impacted my psyche to be able to see myself in situations that I hadn't been prior, but to know that if I wanted to make it happen, if I wanted to look this glamorous, if I wanted to dress in certain styling, I could. But also the bending of identity to see myself positioned in ways that I had never seen myself pose in front of a camera, my hair styled in ways that had never been done before. So this also, for me, was an internal paradigm shift of understanding, oh, okay, identity is purely the way that we present ourselves to the world, the way that we perform in this external world. And if I don't live in that external world and I live in the moments where I'm purely in my internal world, there is no form of identity. I'm not thinking about my race, age, gender, sexuality, any of those things. And so for me, it was very liberating to have that moment of reflecting that identity really is this performance. And so what phase two, where I'll wrap up is have understood generative AI as a tool to reveal myths in my phase two. So after sharing that first essay, the New Schools academic journal reached out to commission me to write another essay that kind of dives deeper. And so what I used this opportunity was to go into the paradoxes of intelligence, of Western contemporary forms of intelligence, of what does truth and correction actually mean in a world where we have this idea of intelligence and how that form of intelligence is being perpetuated into AI. And so through this research, I was already building on research that I've been doing recreationally for my own interests. And that built a lot off of understanding of Plato's legacy on the academy, which Marimba Ani also goes into. And so what does this mean for us to live in a world of understanding what contemporary Western intelligence is, but actually breaking it down and understanding that the root of it is this idea of sociability, like we require a form of sociability, which is language. We require a criteria or metric for all of us to agree upon. We acquire this idea of modernity, which also in this form of intelligence negates all past forms of understanding, like indigenous and ancestral forms of understanding the world is relegated as not qualified, and also this form of singularity, which then creates this form of superiority. So what does it mean to have this singular way of being, this ultimate way of being intelligent, which we do things, small things like label some things as hard skills versus other as soft skills. So hard skills being things like being technically proficient, being a programmer, being a scientist, versus soft skills being someone that might work in HR that understands how to navigate relationships between people and understand emotions, and how really there's not really a need to create this hierarchy, but that's the hierarchy that exists within our understanding of intelligence. And so through that, I was able to push this idea or explore this idea of how the way that we understand the world, ideas of science, mathematics, all those things are really forms of myth. It's myth making. It's something that humans have always done for all of humanity. And it's only in the past 200 years or in the past few centuries that we've really pushed this contemporary form of science. And even just exploring the ways that how we lean so heavily on this contemporary Western form of intelligence when it's so defective as far as creating a comprehensive healthcare system that understands the sociability factors of things like cancer and different diseases, or how on the right side, the screen grab of understanding that different communities would create different forms of intelligence. And we call this AI, generally we call it AI, we don't label it with any sort of ethnicity or race, but if AI was to be developed outside in the continent of Africa, maybe in Kenya, we would call it, oh, that's the Kenyan form of AI. So for me, it felt really important to make sure that we're labeling this AI as what it actually is, which is just a mimic of these groups of people in the way that they think, but not actual intelligence. And so it also empowered me to get into this idea of myths and what do myths mean. And so for me, this phase that I'm in now is really using this form of AI, using it as a way to study this myth that we currently exist within, but then also use it visually to create my own myth of what does it mean to design a world that actually feels more aligned with the way that I feel we should be living, or at least the way that I want to live. And so I've labeled this myth and this whole world as Atsukazo, and have been using different generative tools to create the imagery around it, and then using that imagery, those visual frameworks into my studio to then do paintings, whether it's in pastel or oil painting, and using them as visual frameworks is something I can lean on as an artist. So really just creating this cycle of research and creation and blending them all together. So thank you, I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Ari. That's the first time I'm seeing the paintings that you've made, and I love that you've kind of made those images like real, physically real. That's really beautiful. We will do questions after the two talks. So I'll hand over to Dilman, and a quick introduction. So Dilman is a writer, critically acclaimed short story writer and filmmaker. He's working on his debut science fiction novel, Dreams of a Yellow Balloon. And his works of short fiction have been featured in several kind of magazines and anthologies and publications. I came to know Dilman's work through his participation in the Open Lab Africa program. And Dilman is going to share a little bit about his process of realizing images for his story, non-linear story, Japolo. So I'll hand over to you, Dilman, to talk a little bit about your process. And I'll stop sharing.
I think my screen is being shared. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yep, you can see it.
Cool. So I'm mostly going to talk about this kind of graphic, I don't know, it's a graphic novel, an interactive storytelling kind of thing that I've been working on since 2020, and it's called Japolo. I could share the link, but it's still in a closed website, so it's not available to the public because I still consider it as a work in development. Okay, this was an introduction. Mostly I'm a transmedia artist, and why I was creating this story as a transmedia story, which would be presented in a multiplicity of media, not just a film or a short story or something like that. But Japolo itself, it's a non-linear story, and it's based on African cosmologies. it's about folk tales, and I was really inspired by the stories about people who went to the skies, and this was in ancient times before first contact with Europeans or colonizers. Oh yeah, I can use full screen, but last time I did it, it stopped sharing. Is this still sharing? Okay, sorry about that. So the main characters are, of course, characters who who in those stories went to the sky, and they will be the driving force of this story. But then they traveled for a variety of reasons. One went because she broke a pot. Another one was looking for a wife. There was another one who went because of grief over a dead child. But at the end of the day, the experience of traveling was more interesting than the reason for going. And I think in creating this story, I'm also more interested in how ancient Africans were interacting with alternate worlds or other worlds than how they were going to those worlds. So it's a kind of a choose your own adventure story with an infinite storylines, in the sense that like choose your own adventures, normally they have a definite ending, but I was envisioning this as a story that does not have an ending, and it could be something like you'll see in the Marvel universe, where they just create film after film, and then there's graphic novels, and then there's all these, and then the fans also create fan art, and so it's just an expanding universe. But this will be a bit different because it's a transmedia story, where you might find chapter 1 is a song, chapter 2 is a film, chapter 3 is a graphic novel, and then chapter 4 is prose, and then chapter 5 is a poem. It's very experimental in that way. How do I scroll? Okay, but then it's a very highly interactive story tool where it's a choose your own adventure, as you said, but then it would have cyclic links where you don't reach an end. When you get to an end of a story, you can be looped back to choose to make other choices. But it's also, and on the website or the app where it is going to be hosted, the homepage will be dynamic, in the sense that every time a visitor goes to it, the app will remember their last choices, and then it will present to them a new story. But then, because it's going to be kind of a fan contributed story, it will probably be, users will have the chance to contribute stories and storylines through prompts, and also utilizing data sets that we make available within the game, the storytelling game. So briefly, this is what Jopolo is about. And I first created it in 2020. This was for just after the pandemic broke, COVID. And then I think the National Arts Festival in South Africa put out a call, and I presented it to them because they were looking for something online and interactive, and I came up with this idea. At that point, I used tools like Blender and Make Human. Make Human is kind of a 3D, I don't know if it's a 3D tool, but it helps you to create 3D humans, 3D models of humans. And so I was able to generate a lot of characters within a very short period of time. Basically yep.
So sorry to interrupt, but do you mind going into presentation mode, just so people can see your slides a little better?
Yeah, I am presenting.
I think like speaker mode.
This mode?
No. Or maybe you can zoom
because
out.
that was full screen.
Okay, I think this maybe is a little bit clearer, so let's go with this one. Sorry
With
to
this.
interrupt. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I zoom out maybe like this.
Perfect. Yeah, that should be great. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Cool. So yeah, Make Human basically works like the AI tools that we have, but in this case, it doesn't give you an end product. It gives you a starting point, like it gives you a character, and then you can enhance that character to, and you can create the character just with sliders. You click on a slider, like you want to change the shape of the eyes, the hair, the stuff like that. Instead of using prompts like textual prompts, which is in AI. But then it did help me a lot to create all these characters and to create this world very quickly. I think I had only 1 month and I generated more than 50 pages of graphic novel, which was incredible. But then it was, of course, backbreaking work, and it used, because you know, anything with 3D involves a lot of work. So last year when I heard of the fellowship, I thought, oops, and that's just when AI tools were also exploding. And I found it an opportunity to again look at this work and see how AI could maybe help me to advance the story and maybe come to fruition. Because what I did in 2020 was just 50 pages. So somebody can go through all the stories within an hour or so, or less. And you know, the idea is to create an infinity of storylines, so that every day you can go and consume a story or something and you find something new. And of course, I promised to make this really possible, and I was excited about it. Okay, so what excited me also was ability to train my own models, generate characters and backgrounds. And because there's also the chance of for AI to generate each media, which makes like the whole idea that I had very, very possible. But then there were like a few challenges that I came up upon, and most of it was that I think it's still too early for AI tools, especially for stories that involve continuity of characters and worlds. And it's a bit hectic, you know, to get the AI to deliver exactly what you want. And online tools are a bit limiting in terms of high internet costs, especially in a place like Uganda, where data is very, very expensive. But the biggest challenge was that it couldn't give us an accurate depiction of the characters that I wanted. And I'm just going to go through a few examples of this. The first was how it defaults to human hair. This is a texture that is more with very modern women and maybe biracial characters. But and every time I'll just type African woman, this is the kind of hair texture it will give me. But then this is a story set in pre-colonial of a very ancient Africa, so the hair textures wouldn't be like this. I did this like in December 2020, and it was still giving me the same. This was with DALL-E. It gave me this kind of textures. Then today I tried out with Mesh, but it was giving me a lot of headbands, head wraps. I don't know why. And then I kept trying until finally I got a texture that resembles close to what I was looking at. But yeah, the problem also, it comes with the default human and how it represents African people. So this is a photograph from, I think, the 1800s of an African person that we used to train Runway and to generate maybe characters of this. But then when you use the image to image and you try to click variations of this image, the default goes to people who are not African at all. And you look at them. The other challenge of course, of costumes and clothing, like this was the clothing we're aiming for, but then it will give you clothes which were not in the time period and from a very different part of Africa. This, I think, is very West African rather than what we were looking at. So I think maybe the data sets were small, but then the biggest challenge that I got was actually it limiting what we can input into the data sets. And of course, we were looking at this as the kind of, I was looking at this as the kind of costumes that would inspire the story and that will be used in the story. But it looks at it as nudity, and then it censors the, like it says, these images may contain inappropriate content. But of course, when you look at it from a perspective of, you're making a documentary, you're trying to ground a story in a certain time period. You need to be true to that period. And if AI cannot recognize it, then yeah. So to wind up, I was creating a pitch deck of a film set in the near future in rural Uganda, and I wanted visuals to accompany it. And I thought, oops, AI is there, I can try to create it. So when every time I'll try to like look up something, maybe create something, an African village in the near future with round huts, cone-shaped roofs, and I'll try to be as detailed as possible with the prompts. I couldn't get an accurate depiction of rural Africa as I know it today. And I would get this kind of huts which don't really represent anywhere in Africa. Or this, the middle one, this was a bit close. This was with Marge, and then this was with Dali. It was a bit close, but then it was not quite what I was looking for because it's really not the kind of images that we still get in rural Africa. The combinations of grass and brick is strange because if somebody builds with brick, they would have iron sheets. And so it wasn't very accurate. This was mid-journey, but it was completely off. I don't remember the prompts, but this is how the file was saved. So maybe that was the prompt. And yet what I was looking for, I eventually just ended up doing it on using 3D software. And this was close to what I was looking for. What I did, I just got a photograph and then I put a 3D stuff on it. So yeah, those are the big challenges. And I think time is up. And this is also my last slide. Okay.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Dilman. So next up, we have Dr. Tegan Bristow. So I'm going to invite Tegan to respond to both of the sessions that we've just seen. But first of all, a quick introduction. So Tegan is a senior lecturer at Wits School of Arts and has currently started a new role, but Tegan, I'll let you share the work that you've just embarked upon, which is very exciting. In addition to her role at Wits, she's also principal researcher at Fakagesi Digital Innovation Festival and editor-in-chief of the Ellipsis Journal for Creative Research. We've also had the pleasure, as I mentioned, of working together through our Open Lab Africa collaboration. And Tegan is also an artist in her own right and absolutely an expert on issues of African art, culture, and technology. So Tegan, I'd love to hand over to you to respond to both of the works. And I know you're very, very intimate with Dilman's practice. So I'm over to you and feel free to add some other reflections from your other projects.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you. It's really difficult to respond because also haven't seen this much of Dilman's presentations before. It's looking really exciting, and also to meet Ari. Such beautiful work and really interesting and exciting. So yeah, Pamela was mentioning that I've also just taken a new position. So I'm moving now to the MENA region and opening a kind of new media and digital art center in in the Arab world. So kind of shifting my focus a little bit from Africa, and I'm certainly not an expert. Like expert, I think in Africa doesn't really exist. There's so much like multiplicity of knowledge and knowing that there's no way that I can be an expert there. Yeah, in response, what is really interesting to me about Ari's work is the analysis on the position of different knowledge through your exploration. What you called myths. There's sort of the myths of science and the myths of knowledge and how they're constructed and how you're using AI or like ways of exploring AI and yourself in that space to unpack what these positions are. And I think very uniquely comes across the position of media and contemporary media and how that interfaces with history. So the kind of linking of history with contemporary media is really, really fascinating to me. And I found this wonderful. And for Dilman, the ever-present impact of the fictions that you bring that are like this really dynamic mix of Ugandan culture, but also your own world and kind of intellecting your own imagination with the histories and folklore of Uganda, but also something completely, completely different. And in many ways, these are like the two ends of one string. But what Dilman brings is a kind of heightened awareness in the fact that the Ugandan imagination is not present in media art histories or general histories of media, and the sort of huge lack and the sort of present lack in AI and the sort of access to the archive shows this so clearly. So I suppose, the two presentations were so short, and I really don't know if I've got more to say on it than that. But they bring such a highlighted opposing position on that massive hole in understanding and knowledge. And the analysis of that is quite unique and critical. And I think it's really significant that both of you are doing that in very, very different kinds of ways. So can I ask a question to them rather than just respond? Okay. So this is a question for both of you, and I wanted to understand how do you understand your positions as artists to influence either your direct academic or creative community or like a global community in how they understand this kind of critical analysis through your work, or what can shift and change, and even an understanding of AI, in fact, because it's not just really about what's missing, but also what the potentialities of what AI can and cannot do or may influence the future of the world as well. I mean, it's a very generalized question, but I was really trying to find you in your art, in the world, and where you think your influence is most impactful. I'll let Ari start and then go to Dilman. Okay.
That's a great question. I think to answer how I see myself as an artist using this tool, I see it in a way where it's more like reveal, like kind of just like trying to get to the edges and then really reveal this is the container. And I think oftentimes people can not even enter inside. Like often especially when I was presenting this early this year and people were feeling extremely scared of these tools, the way that I presented it in context with this is the way that you can think about it critically. And these are also the artistic possibilities. It gave people that permission that I didn't realize so many people didn't have to just enter and explore. So I feel like for me, the natural way that I exist is just very curious and trying to find out what is this and really just like trying to get to the ends of it. And I see the way that I'm using it differently from Dilman in that I'm not trying to make it work for me. I'm just trying, and I don't know if this is what you're doing, Dilman, but the way that I see it is more of, I'm not trying to make this work for me. I see you for what you are, and I'm just going to kind of show you what you are a little bit, or just like use your limitations to then create my own thing, is how I'm really finding it.
And do you feel that, I mean, that's really exciting that the New School invited you to write on this, like more closely, because one of the things that we're wanting to do is also shift an understanding of that space and make what you're showing or reflecting back part of a critical engagement with this. That's yeah. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit and how you've seen that evolved from the work, maybe?
How I've seen the critical engagement evolve.
Yeah.
I think for me, it was more like initially it was, okay, what happens if I do this? I think that shift was really, it went from just seeing what happens to now being more cognizant of this is what is going to happen. Like if I use these words, these are the stereotypes that it has. So it's going to produce that. And for me, I'm also just not really, I've been in different phases of my way of interrogating and challenging systems. And I feel like probably 5 years ago, I would have been a lot more, and even up until maybe a few months ago, I was a lot more adamant on kind of just like, just very focused on these are the defects and highlighting that as much as possible versus where I am now really just being like in the essay was much more, let's remove these things off the pedestal. Like, I think that's really important to me of just making sure that we don't place so much value and put so much trust into things that are so flawed. And because they are coming from a certain perspective, because a different culture or whatever, we just uphold it and maintain it, even if it's clearly flawed. So for me, it's more of, I'm not interested in trying to invest more into that space. This is purely just a reflection of a certain group of people. And I'm more interested in existing within my own spaces.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, wonderful. Dillman.
Yeah, I'm not sure I got the question entirely, but do
you want me to repeat? Are you good? Okay, cool.
You could just summarize it again.
Yeah, yeah, sorry, because it sort of came from a bit of conversation around what I was thinking. So the question really asked, I actually wrote it down, so I'm going to read it. How do you understand your position as an artist and the influence that you have? Oh, wait.
Okay. I think, like early, at some point in my life, I used to think of myself as a social activist. But of course, I never went out in the streets with placards and all that, but I realized that from the stories that I tell, people are going to interpret Africa or my worlds very differently. Recently, I was giving a talk to a school in Canada, a university, and they had read one of my books, The Future God of Love. And they were, because it was about, again, a world set in very pre-colonial times, but it had a lot of technology. And then they were asking me, is this set in the future? And I'm like, no, it's set in the past. And they're like, but there's a lot of technology, this, and yet it's in Africa. And I'm like, yeah. I mean, it's how we've been taught to look at Africa that we think of pre-colonial Africa as not having any kind of technologies at all. So the way I present the world that I've come to know as pre-colonial Africa, it kind of it's kind of an activism in a way. And so when I found AI, or like when AI bloomed, and I thought, oops, okay, it will be easier for me to create these worlds because, if I want like a costume, then I don't have to actually sew something. I don't have to pay a designer very expensively. Or if I want to create the hat as we knew it before we had these kind of hats today, I'll probably just design something and feed it onto the AI and all that. But it was, of course, a bit challenging when I realized that, oops, it cannot think about Africa the way I'm thinking. And just from the costumes itself, because we've been made to believe in these costumes as, I don't know if we are prudish or if we are just, what's the word? Like demonizing people who don't, I don't know if demonize is the word, but we think of them as being primitive if you don't wear any clothing. And yet back then, that was the lifestyle. Like people were, and they actually believed they were wearing clothing, because you'll find in the words like of the actually, they have a word for nakedness. And it did not include somebody who was dressed like that, because they were like, oops, this person is dressed up. And some people will be overdressed, even when the Europeans will come and say, oops, you're skimpily dressed. But there are words for all that. And so with me, I think in just challenging people's perceptions of Africa and Africa before colonial, before first contact, it's kind of a big thing in my work. And yeah, that's how I contextualize it. I don't know if it's close to even what you asked.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. And I think, I mean, that's so clear in your work, and also why, well, I personally enjoy your work so much, because it really does challenge that and brings a lot of like interesting imaginations and like even humor sometimes, and like a little bit of interrogating of what that can be and how it is differently in the world. So that's really clear, really clear. So it's good to support that. Yeah, I think that was like my question really. And I feel that, yeah, as I said before, I'm not going to summarize what I said before, but the sort of two ends of the same question is being presented here in such a fascinating manner.
Thank you, Tegan.
Sure.
So we'll open up to everyone. I have some questions, but I will not be selfish. And so does anyone have any questions for Ari, Dilma, or Tegan in the sessions today? Oh, you're on mute in the room.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentations, they were really cool. I do have one question, which is, what do you, coming as artists, wish that the developers of this technology would keep in mind as they are bringing technology forward? If anything.
I just want to make sure that the panelists heard the question, and then if not, maybe Sarah, you could even come up with the laptop and repeat it. I just want to make sure everyone heard your question.
I heard it.
I can repeat if
I heard the question.
Okay.
I think I got it as well.
I don't know why that's a hard question to answer. There's a little bit of an echo.
Yeah, I think the CVPR 2023 host needs to mute them, the room.
No, I have to do it.
Okay. I think it something for developers to keep in mind. I mean, like the things that I would love to happen are not even purely aligned with what I've already done. Like some things, I think one reason why I don't use these tools as much is because they're so screen-based. I don't even know what it looks like for these tools to not be screen-based and maybe be more about other ways of interacting. But I think I'm also just personally in a time where I don't want to spend so much time using screens to generate work, though I really enjoy what's coming out of this. I think there's a lot of transparency even that could be really interesting to just push more on. Like a lot of what I was saying earlier of there's so many assumptions of if it's created in this Western world, then it just exists as that thing without any attributes on top of it. Like this is an AI that is built in the Western world, or like United States or whatever. So it should be called US AI. And then that allows for people to understand, okay, this is a type of AI. It's not the only AI, like a form of just a self-awareness, I think would be really nice for developers to have in these tools. And even also just the fact that, I mean, there's so many things like this developer should be keeping in mind forms of equity. I know these are conversations that are happening, but forms of equity as far as artists' work just being scraped and used inside of these tools. I think one thing that I was pushing a lot when I was working internally was how can there be some sort of like royalty system? If you're going to use the style of a certain artist, can we just have all these artists on catalog. Every time I say I want to do it in the style of Picasso, Picasso's estate gets something in the same way that a lot of other small emerging artists could do. I think doing things like pushing more to empower other groups of people to be able to build their own sort of systems like this, like hand over everything that you've been able to create, and so that other people can also create something similar to you, since all of this has been built off of what other people have done too. It's just a different way of materializing it. So if these developers could then also invest in developers in other parts of the world and get them to help them create their own AI models and tools that are the Brazilian tool or this kind of tool, would be interesting.
Yeah, I think what my presentation was all about really is what developers will keep in mind, just making sure the AI kind of is responsive to any kind of culture and any kind of person. I don't know how to put it, but yeah, so that it's when you put in a image to image thing and you put an African person, it shouldn't give you white people as alternatives. But yeah, beyond just the cultural thing, I also think the art is kind of therapy for many people. For me especially, like I started writing because from therapy to heal from trauma and all that. So if I get a tool that does for me everything, it kind of takes away something from my being a human. And I think that's one reason why a lot of artists are up against, AI kind of models. What I would love is a tool that I can collaborate with, not prompt and say, oh, create for me this scene, and then boom, there is a scene. Something like Make Human, where you say, okay, it gives you a starting point, and then it eases your work, because when I was learning 3D, I tried modeling humans and I couldn't. I failed, and I thought I was not ever going to make it in 3D. And then I found Make Human, which gives you a base human model. And then using sliders, you can create your own person. And then you can go and tweak it to look how you want it to look. I think that will be a more rewarding tool at the end of the day, because as an artist who works from a place of deprivation, like I don't have access to a lot of resources, and most of the time I'm the only person in my team. I need tools that are going to make my work like very, very easy. And I imagine a point where AI reaches and it can help you to animate, like you have your character and you type in a prompt, walk from the door to the bed, to the window, and then the thing animates for you automatically without you having to rig the character and manually create a walk circle and then put it through all that motions. It will be nice to have such a tool, but I think if developers keep in mind, the art process, and then so we have a tool that complements an artist's work rather than kind of sort of replaces it by creating an end product. I think that will be great.
Thanks, Dolman. We'll open up for more questions. I was just going to bring some of those 2 points together, in that another thing that could be useful to keep in mind is the difference between kind of capability and then actual art making. So the ability to kind of like represent the idea of like a chair or an object or an artifact is maybe slightly different from that having some kind of cultural kind of context meaning. So as developers, and when positioning kind of the narratives around these tools, is being able to kind of create any type of creativity or artifacts. Maybe we can just position them, as Ari mentioned, as starting points or things that are coming from a very particular context that we invite artists and image makers to then kind of position in their own, to have some kind of sense of agency over, in terms of trying to realize exactly what they want from them. Did anyone else have any questions? Just going to the chat.
I think we're just unfortunately at time.
Okay. If no one else has any other questions, then I'll just leave it to say a huge thank you to Ari, Dilman, and Tegan for two really brilliant demos and a really great kind of response and discussion. We've opened lots of kind of questions and thoughts and thinking, and I hope also for the people who are present at CVPR that you continue to kind of invite artists and cultural producers and creatives to think about not just how these tools are created, but what they actually mean and what people can do with them. And so finally, a huge thank you to the co-organizers and to Reader and team. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Ari, Dilman, Tegan, Pamela, Tong, and Eva for putting together this incredible panel. And we will make sure to try to get the recording from the conference organizers and share it with you all.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
So do you hear me? Oh,
yes.
I can hear myself. Okay, let me. Okay, so I'll try to do it this way. Thank you for coming. We have the Best Paper Award right now, and all the papers are very nice. We were very excited about seeing your papers, and we were very impressed of the quality of the works that was submitted. Based on the alignment that that we considered papers have with the scope of the workshop, and also as well as the quality of the work, the Best Paper Award goes to towards AI art curation, reimagining City of Helsinki in occasion of its biennial. We will be sending a PDF recognizing this Best Paper Award to the authors. So round of applause for the authors, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. So here's the rest of the team.
Hello. Nice. It's very good to see you. So yeah, well done, well done. So yeah, we'll be sending you a PDF version of a certificate. Yeah, we hope that you succeed in this effort that you're doing. It seems very exciting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very much. Great to meet you.
So going to the next section of the workshop is going to be the poster session. So for the in-person presentations, the venue to set up your posters is downstairs. Just remember to take off your posters at 12 because they're going to be, those stands are going to be used for the afternoon workshops. And for the, even if you're doing an in-person presentation, please join the Discord and be available just in case people have questions. And for the virtual people who are joining us virtually, you could, so if you go to this Discord page where you have the barcode, you could scan it and hopefully it'll take you there. If you couldn't scan that, if you go to the our workshop website, in the accepted papers tab, there's the link that will take you to the Discord. Please join. And when you go to the Discord, we've created multiple spaces for every poster, for every accepted paper, and every accepted paper or every space has a Zoom link where you could talk with people who have questions and present your paper. Yeah, and so yeah, thank you for joining our workshop, and thank you for your participation. And let's stay in touch and continue the conversation. On behalf of all the organizers, I thank all of you. Yeah, yeah.
Can you put the Discord QR code down?
Yeah. Does it? Can you see if it works?
It does. It does.
Oh, nice.
I was logged out of Discord.
Okay, so I'm going to close the Zoom if it's okay. Okay.
Sir, is there still someone here?
Yes, we're here.
Yeah, we're having a problem to connect to showcase the poster because we're online and we actually didn't send the poster to anyone. So we don't know if there is like a Zoom link or something or Discord. I cannot find the correct page where there should be or correct discussion where there should be the link.
Yes, I will put the Discord link on the chat. Yeah.
Sorry?
So there is a Discord that I'm going to put it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually I'm sharing the QR code that takes you to the Discord now, but I'll send it to the chat so you could click on it easily.
But from Discord, is there like another link that we have to follow?
Yes.
Like
Yeah. So if you go to Discord, we have created multiple spaces for every poster.
Okay.
And,
okay, great. Now we see it. Okay. And so we click the link and then we showcase our poster.
Yeah. So yeah, if you click on each link, it should take you to the room, and hopefully the authors are going to be there too.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you.
I should actually